Good afternoon. I'm Simone Cavallaro, Director of the Stigler Center. Thank you all for joining us for our first webinar. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the difficult situation at hand with the COVID-19 pandemic. We are in a unprecedented time, and our thoughts are with all those who are affected all across the world. We also like to express our gratitude to the healthcare workers on the front lines, both in the US and abroad. Thank you. We are aware that there is a high demand of reliable and trusted information. To help both students, alumni, faculty, and the greater community stay informed in this difficult period, the Stigler Center has developed the following special initiatives. Firstly, we are releasing weekly episodes of our podcast, Capital Isn't, co-hosted by Luigi Zingales and Kate Waldock, focused on coronavirus and its economic implications. The latest episode, for example, is on the cost-benefit analysis of the economic shutdown implemented as a measure to contain the outbreak. Secondly, we add the coronavirus section to our online publication, promarket.org. That includes extensive coverage of the global economic and political implications of COVID-19. Thirdly, our programming will be moved online, where we will continue to develop thought-provoking webinars, including a series based on the themes of the 2020 Antitrust and Competition Conference, Monopolies and Politics. We are also putting together teaching materials based on all these relevant content that can be used as a resource to address these important topics. As we transition our programming to virtual platforms, please excuse us in advance for any technical difficulties that may arise, as this is new for us and potentially taxing on the IT infrastructure. Back to today. We are happy to host Thomas Philippon and Chad Syverson for a conversation moderated by Guy Rolnik on capitalism and markets in America. Professor Philippon's book, The Great Reversal, How America Gave Up on Free Markets, is available for purchase online from our campus bookstore partner, the Seminary Co-op. If you're interested, please see the link on the event description. Before we begin the discussion, please note, we're on the record and live streaming to the Stigler Center YouTube channel. Please feel free to share the broadcast on your social media. As usual, views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. We look forward to an engaging conversation. But before we begin, please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Thomas Philippon is the Max Heine Professor of Finance at NYU Stern School of Business. He has studied various topics in macroeconomics and finance, including systemic risk, crisis resolution mechanism, and the size of the finance industry, to name a few. His recent work has focused on the Eurozone crisis, financial regulation, and the market power of large firms. Professor Philippon has won many accolades, including being named as the IMF as one of the top 25 economists under 45. Chad Syverson is the George Tiao Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at Chicago Booth. His research spans several topics, with a particular focus on the interactions of firm structure, market structure, and productivity. Professor Syverson also serves as an editor of the Journal of Political Economy and as a research associate of the National Bureau of Economics Research, among others. Our moderator today is Guy Rolnik, who is a clinical associate professor of strategic management at Chicago Booth, where he teaches classes on the political economy of regulation and the news media. He has over 30 years of experience in financial journalism, business, and politics, among others. For the last few years, his work has been focused on the dynamics of regulatory capture, a topic dear to the Stigler Center. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simone, and good afternoon to all our viewers and participants in this virtual Stigler Center event. We have picked ourselves an incredible timing for this event, and I'm not referring to any downside of having this event done online or remotely, but rather the opposite. The corona crisis, I believe, highlights and reinforces some of the most important questions raised by Professor Thomas Philippon in his important book. I will start with some quick context. When Luigi took over the reign of the Stigler Center 5 years ago, one of the first issues we decided to focus on was the question, do we have a problem of concentration and competition in the US? This was also the focus of much of the work we did in our newly launched blog at that time, promarket.org. Back in 2016, there was not a lot of research and literature on the questions of concentration in the US, but gradually we've seen more and more people interested in those questions of concentration, antitrust, and the political economy of big business in general. The conversation quickly moved to the market power, of course, of the digital platforms or digital monopolies, depend what is your opinion. Now, Thomas Philippon book is one of the most important books, if not the most important one, that is addressing these key questions. Like many of the scholars interested in these questions, Thomas was not born in the US and spends a lot of time in France and in Europe, in France in his case, which gave him a different perspective on the questions here. He actually starts the book that I dearly, dearly recommend with what he describes as the deterioration of competition and the quality of services in various industries in the US compared to Europe. He compares the situation when he first came to the US more than 20 years ago, and in his eyes, US was by far leading, and the situation today that US is lagging compared to the EU. I will now ask Thomas to share with us in 10 minutes the main findings and ideas of the book. He will also share with us some slides, and then we'll get Professor Chad Syverson to respond, and then I will have a few questions for them, and we'll also talk about the corona crisis and how does it integrates into the story here. So, Thomas, Professor Philippon, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Simone and Guy, for the introduction. Thank you, Chad, for being here to discuss the book. So like Guy was saying, I'm just going to give you a 10 minutes overview of the book. So obviously I won't get into all the details, but that will leave plenty of time for questions and comments. So the book is called The Great Reversal, and Guy already alluded to the reason I chose that title. The reason is that over the past 20 years, I've noticed a change in the way American markets operate. When I came here 20 years ago from Europe, I was struck by the fact that many of the goods and services you would buy here in the US were cheaper than in Europe. Despite the fact that the US was about 20% richer on a per capita basis, and it still is about 20% richer on a per capita basis than Europe, therefore you would expect things to be more expensive. And yet many goods and services were cheaper. That was true for airline tickets, that was true for telecom services, that was true for many services. Much to my surprise, if you look at the same data today, you see the opposite pattern, not in all industries, but in many of them. So one of the striking reversal is in the cost of internet access. 20 years ago, by far, the US was the leader, especially compared to Europe, simply because local calls were free in the US. Therefore, you could dial up and stay online for long enough to get some data, despite the fact that connections were slow at the time. So clearly, it was much cheaper to get internet access at home in the US 20 years ago than in any other country in Europe. And today, the US is more expensive, but it's not a little bit more expensive. It went from being a lot cheaper to being more than twice as expensive as every other developed country in the world, right? So you get broadband access for the same speed for about $30 in most of the developed world, between 30 and 35. That is from Japan, France, Korea, Germany, the UK. Everybody's in the same ballpark. The US is at 68. Okay, so that's more than twice the average of other rich countries. So the question is, what happened? Why is it so expensive now? And what has changed over the past 20 years? That's what motivated the book. Well, if you look at the telecom industry, two things happened at the same time. You had a rise in concentration together with a rise in profit margins or markup, like we like to say in economics. So the green line here measures the evolution of the change of the concentration ratio of the top 8 firms. That is the market share of the top 8 firms in the US. Okay, so that moved by a lot, by about maybe 40 or 40% over that period of time. So a very large increase in concentration, together with a very large increase in price cost margin in that industry. Now, of course, you could say I'm cherry picking the telecom. So is that true more broadly? If you zoom out and you look at all the industries, then you lose a lot of the granularity and the precision, but the pattern seems to hold. So if you look at profit margins, somewhere in the 2000s, they increased. Now you can see in this graph that this is profit per aggregate profit of the US businesses relative to private GDP. Of course, that moves a lot. Obviously, when there's a business cycle, it goes up and down. But it used to, wiggle around something like 7%, and now it wiggles around something like 10%. So somewhere in the 2000s, you had this structural increase and very persistent increase in profit margins. So what we saw in the telecom industry is not true just for telecoms. And the same is true also for concentration, although this is a very complicated and hotly debated topic, because if you want to look at the economy as a whole, it's very hard to get the right granularity in concentration measures. But broadly speaking, concentration has gone up by about 20%, or 25% in most industries in the US. That means that you lost a firm. Like if you had 5 main firms, now you're down to 4, okay? 4 down to 3. That gives you a sense of what happened in most industries. Now, this triggers 2 big questions. Okay, the first is it good or bad? Okay, and the reason we have a debate is not so much that we disagree about the numbers, although there is always some disagreement, is that there are 2 very plausible interpretations of the same fact. The first, which I call for simplicity good concentration, is that the rise in concentration is driven by productivity growth, which is stronger for the firms that are already leading their industries. Okay, so if the top firms was 10% better, and now it becomes 15% better, well, then you're going to see that they're going to take even more market share. So you're going to see a rise in concentration. But of course, that's good news. It just means that we have higher productivity. So that's going to come together with strong productivity and low prices. And if you look at the data in recent years, all the time you see something like that happening. It comes together with a lot of investment in intangible assets. So maybe the big firms are just better at doing intangible assets, and therefore, over time, they're going to take over a higher market share. But that's nothing to worry about. It's good news. The flip side is the bad concentration story, where really what you're saying is that, well, the reason we have high concentration and lack of entry, lack of challenge of the leading firms is because they've managed successfully to increase their barriers to entry. So it is very hard to go and compete with them, and therefore they can enjoy these fat profit margins, and nobody is going to come and challenge them. Now, if you think about industries in the US, it's very clear that on the one hand, you have industries like retail and wholesale that looks more like the good concentration story, and things like telecom, airlines, and healthcare that looks more like the bad concentration story. So the thing that's tricky, of course, is to figure out what about the rest? Okay, where is the line? Are we seeing more good or more bad concentration? Okay, so that's to make the first question I want to try to understand. The second one, which is tightly connected, is at the end of the day, then is it because of technological change, or is it because of policy changes, or perhaps policy mistakes that we've seen these changes? Okay. So let's start with good versus bad concentration. So let me give you the prime example of something that looks like good concentration from the perspective of economics. That's the story of Walmart. So Walmart market share is the red triangle, was 0 in the 1970s, it went to 60% of its. So the category here includes big box retail stores. Okay, so from 0 to 60% of its industry, of course, that's an amazing increase. But you can see in green, the profit margin over the period of time was flat, maybe slightly declining, although that's mostly a composition effect. So to a first order, you can say Walmart was gaining market share and having a constant profit margin. So what it means is that all the productivity gains that came from the very large investment in intangible IT infrastructure that Walmart did, all of these gains in productivity were passed on as lower prices to consumers. The other thing that's interesting with the story of Walmart is it's also a good example of how capitalism is supposed to work, which is look at the early 2000s. Now Walmart is around 60% market share. People start to worry. In fact, if you look at the newspaper at the time, you see lots of discussion about Walmart is getting too big. Maybe we should do something. Maybe we need to do an antitrust action against Walmart. Okay, and that discussion was very active. And then it died. But why? Well, obviously because Amazon came in. See, so the problem created by this firm, which was very successful because it was very innovative, but perhaps became too dominant, was sold by the market with entry from Amazon, which, by the way, Amazon is not even classified in the same industry code. So you wouldn't even see it in that graph. But that is exactly how the market should work. Productivity growth, investment, competition, the leading firm can take over the market, but not for too long, because then somebody else comes in, usually from a place you didn't expect, and start competing away. Okay, so this is the great story that we like to tell. The question is that the story in the US over the past 20 years? And my argument is no. My argument is, if you look at the data, so this is going to be a bit abstract, but this graph is showing you one way of classifying the data. So suppose you look at all the industries in the US, and you try to understand the kind of concentration we are seeing. So on the one group, you're going to classify concentration that come together with a lot of IT investment, intangible investment, lower prices, strong productivity growth, i.e. the Walmart style concentration. Okay, this I will call good concentration. Here it's called PC1. So PC is a statistical tool that we use to classify the data. It's called principal component. So PC1 is the one where we see a lot of concentration together with low prices, intangible, productivity, and stuff like that. That's the green line. And then in red, you see the one that corresponds more to the bad concentration, where it comes together, the concentration comes together with higher prices, almost no entry, very low turnover of the leader, and not much productivity growth, and fat margins. Okay, and that's the red. So the green has always existed in the US, and it still exists today. So of course, nobody is making the argument that there is no industry in the US that is dynamic and driven by innovation. There are still plenty. But what's striking is the red used to be not very prevalent, and now it's more prevalent than the green. So the story of my book is that we've let too many industries go through cycles of bad concentration. Not all of them, but if you look at the big picture, too many. Okay, so at that point, of course, there is much more in the book, as you can imagine, but I want to be short. So at that point, you can ask the question, okay, is it technology or policy? Now, that's a very hard question to ask because these things move together all the time. So how could you tell apart a technological explanation from a policy explanation? Well, maybe you can look at a region which has the same technology as the US, but might, for some reason, have a different policy over this period. And Europe comes to mind. Of course, the match is not perfect, to be clear. So if you look at Europe, you have nothing to say about Google and Amazon because they simply don't exist there, or at least Google and Facebook because they don't exist there, at least not to the same extent. I mean, we have Spotify, but it's a smaller scale yet. So we don't have a good comparison for this high-tech industry. For all the other sectors, however, from the telecom, all the transportation, all the airlines, the energy market, all of that is very comparable. The technology is the same, okay? So, and of course, car manufacturing, but all of the manufacturing sector. So for this, we can say technology is the same. It's widely shared. So if we see big differences, maybe it's going to be because of policy. So then the question is, do we see differences? And the answer is yes. And it's not random differences. It's because Europe, for a long time, was lagging behind the US in terms of having free markets. That is, having market where you have entry, competition, and where consumers have choice and low prices. And this was like the mantra of the 1990s. Please get your act together. Start to do like the US. Deregulate your market. Have lower barriers to entry. And the surprising thing is not so much that this was said, because that was true and needed to be said. The surprising thing is somehow it actually happened. So this plot shows you the number of product market reform. PMR is product market reform in the EU. So roughly you can see that following the single market in the mid-90s, around 95, we have one major reform per country per year, okay, for about 10 to 15 years. So that's a lot of reforms. Let me give you one example, which is a clean example. We know exactly what happens. This is the price of telecom services in France. So France used to be, as I explained earlier, about maybe something like 15 to 20% more expensive than the US, depending on exactly which part of the telecom industry you're looking at, until 2011. And in 2011, you see this sharp discontinuity. And today, France, in 2014, will go down to about 30% cheaper than the US. Today, it's more like 40% cheaper than the US. Now, the thing that's nice is only one thing changed in 2011, which is we gave a license to a fourth operator. We used to have an oligopoly with 3 legacy carriers. And of course, like all nice oligopolies with 3 carriers, they colluded and had prices that were all the same and all very high, sounds like the US today. And then they also lobbied very hard against the entry of the 4th carrier, as you can imagine. But then, and successfully, by the way, because the new entrant wanted to enter for at least 8 years, got denied. But then in 2011, the regulator changed their mind actually became more independent and said it was a good idea for consumers. They let, and they actually helped the entry of the fourth carrier. And the new carrier entered at half the price of the existing ones. Literally, the same contract that you used to buy for 40 euros, you now buy for 20 euros, which is why if you're in France today, you can get unlimited cell phones, unlimited data and text and voice for a smartphone at high speed for 20 euros per month. 20 euros per month, right? About 2.5 times less than in the US. This is all because of a change. In that case, it's a change in regulation of licensing, actually. Now, this is one example of this PMR. If you look at all of them together, so you start accumulating all of these reforms, this plots one such measure by the OECD that try to count how many regulations restrict entry across countries in Europe. You can see on the left, the first vintage of data we have is from 1998. So in 1998, every green dot is an EU country and the red line is the US. Essentially, in 1998, every country in Europe had more regulation against entry, more barriers to entry than the US. The only exception at the bottom, of course, as you can imagine, is the UK. Over time, the green dots start to go down. Now, if you go from one vintage to the next, to be honest, not much changes, which is why people didn't notice it. And I say people, I put myself in that basket. I didn't see it in real time. I was completely unaware of that. Because from one vintage to the next, every 5 years, doesn't matter. But over 10 years, you start seeing a difference. Over 20 years, you see definitely a big difference. Okay, and so today, all of the countries in Europe have, if anything, slightly fewer barriers to entry than the US. Okay, so that's a very important change. And then you can trace that back also to the price cost margin, the markup, the profit rate. There's many ways to do it. You will always find the same story. The profit margins, roughly speaking, the profit margin in Europe today are exactly what they were in the US 20 years ago. But the US has increased its profit margin by quite a bit. So if you take that as a benchmark, then you see that there is this excess markup in the US to the tune of, depending on how you count, between 5 and 10%. I think my point estimate with a bunch of standard errors is around 7 points. So I think the markup in the US has increased by about 7 points since 2000 on average across all industries. And you can see that by looking at investment data prices and comparing with Europe. Now let's put some numbers so it becomes clear for people who maybe are not economists. That's about $300 per month extra paid by the median household. If you aggregate across all the households and of course over 12 months, that's about $600 billion each year that are paid by household to firms as excess profits. That is things they shouldn't be paying if markets were as competitive as they used to be. If you then use a model to understand the macroeconomic implications of this, then of course you would have the $600 billion of savings for consumers, but you wouldn't stop there because we know that competitive economies are more efficient. Competitive economies have more innovation typically. They also have stronger investment, higher wages. Once you take into account all of these positive effects from competition, my point is that we are missing about $1 trillion of private GDP and $1.25 trillion of labor income. But you might ask, how is that possible? Well, that's because profits are too high, remember. So in my simulation, if I return the economy to the level of competition that prevailed 20 years ago, profit would shrink by 250 billion and labor income by 1.25 trillion. So that's a lot of labor income. That's a lot of money for people who only earn labor income, which is typical of the middle class. Okay, so then to conclude, what happened? How do we understand these changes? So there is, to some extent, a European paradox and an American paradox. Now, to be perfectly honest, I understand better the European paradox. In fact, I think I solved the European paradox completely, which is I know exactly what happened. What changed in the late 1990s in Europe was the single market. We started implementing the single market. That changed completely the political economy of regulation in Europe, changed competition policy. That's when we started implementing first at the EU level and then down at the country level, stronger and independent regulators in all kinds of market regulations, not just antitrust. In fact, most of it was not antitrust. It was regulation, removing barriers to entry, removing licensing requirements. And what's interesting is this was triggered by the single market, but then it has very far-reaching consequences. So I think that's what happened in Europe. The American paradox, I don't really know. I don't understand it fully. I can show you some suggestive evidence, but that's the best I can do. What I can say is that for sure, in the 2000s, there's a sharp increase in corporate lobbying and a sharp decrease in antitrust activity. I think that's not controversial. To the extent we can measure, we also see a significant increase in barriers to entry, both of the regulatory types. That is, we see more and more licensing requirements, more and more excessive regulations by the government. So that makes it hard for small firms to enter and grow. And at the same time, we see more predatory behavior by the tech or by many industries, but that's particularly strong in tech and healthcare, of large firms taking advantage of their large market dominance to either acquire and kill innovations or prevent entry by competitors. So that's what happened to lobbying expenditures. Now I have data from the 90s where it was pretty flat. So somewhere around 2000, you see this beginning of a large increase in lobbying expenditures. It continued after 2009, it's just that the data became less reliable. In Europe, we don't have the same time series, but what I can see in the data is lobbying in Europe today is about what it was in the US in the 1990s. So it's not zero, of course. In fact, it's quite a bit of money, but it's nowhere near what we see in the US today. So I think that's part of the explanation. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Thomas. So Chad Syverson's research has a particular focus on the interactions of firm structure, market structure, and productivity. Now, many industrial organization economists are more skeptical about the importance of concentration measure for the questions of competition. So the question to you, Chad, the first question that I want to hear from you, Chad, is which of the evidence do you think in Thomas' book you find very convincing and which is less?
I think I'd answer that question in terms of convincing about what. So this notion of a reversal, I think if one interprets the reversal as, and I think the book is set up a little bit with this narrative that, 25 years ago, US markets were considerably more competitive than European markets. And now things have flipped and the Europeans are more competitive than the US. I think the evidence for that in the book, if you sort of go into the detail, is on most solid ground for the telecom example, exactly the one that Thomas spent a lot of time talking about. I think there's a reasonable case to be made that there has been a real 180, and where the US used to be notably more competitive than Europe, things seem to have flipped. I think almost every other element of the book is better at making the case for, rather than a great reversal, a great convergence. I think it's pretty clear if you assemble all the data that Thomas has done in the book that European markets have become more competitive over the last 2 decades or so. I think it's much less clear that they have become more competitive than the US markets. So I would really qualify it as more of a convergence than a reversal. And I think you can see that in a couple different ways. So one is if you go sort of industry by industry, sector by sector, outside telecom, I think it's far from clear that there's been this broad-based movement of European markets past the competitiveness level of the US. So finance, for example, do we really think finance in Europe is more competitive than the US? Now, I know Thomas, in other work, not in the book, has written a little bit about fintech. Well, he does write a little bit about fintech in the book, but has done more in other work on fintech, and maybe Europe has a leg up on that. We'll see. That's not really big enough to matter much yet. But I think just broad-based, I don't think most people would say the finance sector, which is a big sector, is more competitive. Retail, that's an example Thomas talked about. There are very good European retail companies and there are very good American retail companies. And those sectors, which are also, again, quite large, seem to be competitive in both areas. Personal services, you think about, say, hairstyling, lawn care services, that sort of thing that a lot of people use on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. I don't think you'd argue that those markets are less competitive in the US than in Europe. So I would say if you want to just speak not for a particular industry, but the whole collection of evidence, I think the book is on much stronger footing talking about a great convergence than a great reversal. So in terms of what I think is proven effectively by the book, I think the book is effective. I just wouldn't couch those results in terms of this notion of reversal, but rather convergence.
Thomas, beside the telecom industry, can you point us to another industry where you feel that you have strong evidence that the case is of reversal?
So first of all, I don't necessarily disagree with Chad on that. I think that the case for relative catch-up, that is the fact that Europe has improved relative to the US, that case is much easier to make than the fact that there was an absolute change, like that Europe has become more competitive on an absolute level. It's become relatively more competitive starting from a lower position. Now, whether it went all the way to catching up and overtaking or not, that's a harder case to make. And I also agree that it's not a case you can make for all industries. There are many industries where it's just hard to compare prices, you know. So one reason I look at the telecom in particular is because we have some data where you can, you know, per gigabyte, you get a good sense of you're looking at the same content, the same product, and you can compare prices directly. Another one that is strikingly more competitive in Europe today than it was 20 years ago in Europe is the transport sector. So airlines, of course, are way more competitive in Europe today than they were 20 years ago. Whether they become more competitive in the US, then we'll get into the same debate. But I think for airlines, I would also say it's overtaken because it's just cheaper. Like their profit margins are lower. I think the technology is the same. I haven't seen any convincing quality adjustment that could explain the differences in prices. So I think I would put airlines in that sector as well. Although, to be clear, it's complicated because one of the reasons, so the airlines in Europe, two things happen, of course. One is we introduced low-cost airlines. And what's interesting is that many of these ideas that made Europe more competitive came from the US. Literally, we copied US ideas. That's how we got competitive. And low-cost airlines, that's very much the business model was really developed in the US. But now the real companies that are very successful at doing low-cost flying is EasyJet and Ryanair, and they are in Europe. And they are very big and very competitive and very efficient. So I think they've been a great boost to the airline industry. Now, of course, and then that diffused because the trains have to compete with the airlines. The trains also are under pressure, and the bus service or the cars are also under pressure. So then the whole transport industry, I think, has become quite more competitive in Europe as well. The other ones that are more complicated to look at is the energy sector. I'm still trying to understand the data. It's very complicated. There is definitely a decline, I think, as far as I can tell, of the number of providers you can choose from to get heating at home, you know, whether it's gas or oil. In the US, prices seems to be a bit on the high side, as far as I can tell. But it's very hard to compare the market structure with that in Europe because of nuclear energy in some countries and some other stuff. So that the transport will be the second big example in my mind. And then the elephant in the room, of course, is healthcare. But healthcare, I have a chapter on the book on healthcare. But the thing with healthcare is, of course, there is no free market for healthcare anywhere in the world. So the benchmark is not obvious. So all we can say is that the best estimate is that the waste in the American healthcare system, if you look at the book by Case and Deaton, is of the order of $1 trillion a year. So that's a lot of money.
Yeah. So let's go back to the questions of what are the drivers of that divergence or reversal that we've seen. So last week, Luigi and Kate had in their podcast in Capitalism, they had Paul Krugman, and they asked him when he looks at the growth of inequality in the U.S. in the last 20 or 30 years, what does he think are the main drivers? And he said 90% of the growth in inequality had to do with political institution, and only 10% is globalization and technology. When we look at the questions of competition and concentration in the trends that are documented in your book, what do you think would be the share there in terms of what was driven by politics, what was driven by markets?
It's very hard to do. Of course, well, what's clear is it varies a lot across industries. I think I don't think it's near 90-10. I think it's much closer to 50-50 for sure. You have many markets where first of all, it's obvious that technology plays a key role in many of these industries and in driving some of the concentration. So that there is no denial, and we have a lot of research on that. On the political side, it's there. The thing is hard to quantify the total, but if you look at the drop in antitrust enforcement or the drop in pro-competition policy at the federal level and at the state level, I can say that it's surprisingly well explained by the pattern of lobbying expenditures. So I think that there is a strong case there that this expenditures have been quite successful at allowing the market leaders to dominate even more. So I'd say maybe a third or half.
I see. Chad, what is your take on the questions of the driver? What do you think, how important was the politics playing here?
I think they both matter. I'm not sure if I'd be able to give a number. I'd say my number would be closer to Thomas than a 90-10 cut for sure. I think, and actually that's one of the things I like best about the book is there's a lot of treatment and a good treatment of the political economy of the situation. And in fact, I think about a lot of the market power stuff in the book is not so much the traditional, here's a deadweight loss triangle and the firm has downward sloping demand, so it reduces quantity and the standard textbook analysis. It really is, you have to understand the political economy and sort of the rent-seeking behavior and rent-preserving behavior that seems to be going on and that the book documents. I think that's where the book is the most insightful in terms of what might be going on in terms of just the interaction between all these things in the data. So I'd say that is, it's great that the book covers it because it's a factor and you can't ignore it. It's not all technology. Technology matters a lot, but there is a big interaction here, I think, with the political economy, and this book wrestles with that.
Chad,
I could give you, Guy, maybe I could give you one example of that. So again, it's slightly easier to do it in Europe because the thought experiments are simpler. So the most controversial antitrust decision in Europe over the past many years is obviously the Alstom-Siemens merger case. So Alstom and Siemens are two gigantic firms that manufacture train equipment, and so it goes all from the train tracks and signaling equipment and stuff like that. Okay, and they were both they are both successful companies, but also compete globally with firms from China, and so they started making the case that they need to merge in order to be able to compete better globally. And what's interesting is the political economy of it. Siemens is based in Germany. Alstom is based in France. So these are the two largest members of the European Union. Both governments were on the record saying this is a great idea. So now you have a political system where by far the two most influential members are pushing very hard to get a merger approved between these two companies. And there is absolutely no doubt that this thing 25 years ago or before the single market would have gone through. There's zero doubt that this would have happened. But in that case, because the institutions are very independent, they just looked at the merger case purely like a merger case. It's okay, is it good, is it bad? What are the plus, what is the minus? What is it going to do to consumers? And is that really going to help them on a global scale? And the conclusion was, well, no, I think it's not going to. So they said no, despite immense political pressure. So that's a very big deal. Okay. So this shows the importance of the political economy system. And it shows that there the key was really the extent to which the regulators are somewhat insulated from political pressure. And I think what happened in the US over the past 20 years is this insulation hasn't disappeared, but has weakened over time.
Chad, you're one of the leading experts in economics on productivity. Can you tie some of your findings on productivity in the US with Thomas' finding on competition in the US?
No, I think that's an important point about the case I was talking about before and whether it's convergence or reversal. Some of the big aggregate facts that the book talks about and that economists have been dealing with for the last 5 years, like the slowdown in productivity growth, which you talked about, the slowdown in investment, that's been going on everywhere. That is not a US-centric problem. So that's not to say there's no correlation between antitrust policy and productivity growth, but I don't think that that's the number one answer here, because the slowdown is going on everywhere. With, if you accept the premise that there's very different levels of antitrust scrutiny, and that's arguable, but if you accept that, it's not explaining the differences we see in productivity growth. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that to the extent that this stuff is sort of all happening together, the increase in profits, the slowdown in investment, the slowdown in productivity growth, it's not all correlated across regions in terms of what's going on and what you might think is going on with antitrust and political lobby. And if I can make one more point about, and this goes back to something Thomas talked about the interaction of the political economy and what's happening. He showed that picture about increasing profit rates for US companies and how it rises around the early 2000s. Well, those were after-tax profits. And we've had a couple large tax reforms, one being in the early 2000s, that have basically reduced effective and more recently statutory corporate tax rates. You know, that's policy, that's the result of lobbying, but that's not antitrust. That is just firms trying to increase their rents through the political process. So this stuff is all interacted, but I think sometimes we need to separate out what's kind of straight down the middle antitrust from a broader political economy perspective of what's going on.
All right, I have many questions on that, but I'd like to move on to the Corona crisis because we don't have enough time. So my first question to both of you, and this is a great timing because over this weekend we've passed the stimulus package. Do you think that we have enough information at this point to assess how the stimulus package in the US and maybe in other countries is going to influence those trends that Thomas, that you document in your book?
Yeah, so if I think about the consequences of the Corona crisis, for what I discuss in the book, I could think of like five things, and then maybe two are negative, two are positive, or potentially negative positive. On the negative side, what's true in any large business cycle, and is going to be even more true in this one, is that the larger firms are more likely to survive, and the smaller firms or younger firms are more likely to disappear. Therefore, the risk of concentration is going to be higher mechanically because of that. And the danger is also that because of the crisis, we relax some of the antitrust guidelines. Okay, so that would be a mistake that we should avoid. The second thing that's also negative and fitting with the book is, lobbying has started immediately. As soon as the crisis started, the lobbyists knew there would be a package coming. They knew there would be lots of government money, and therefore they started jockeying for federal and state dollars immediately. And that's not surprising, it's to be expected, but it's also worrisome because we know the big firms, the connected firms, again, are much better at capturing the regulators and the politicians and at getting the money. So I think these are the two negatives. On the two positives, I think that we are discovering that some of the regulations we had in place maybe were not that necessary because, the crisis forces us to lift some of them, and, maybe we're going to discover that some of them were unnecessary. On the tech sector, I have hope that we are going to have maybe an alternative to Facebook and Google in a few months because of the success of firms like Slack and Zoom. I think I was looking at today, I think the market value of Zoom is more than the market value of the airlines combined today. So that's kind of an amazing reversal. Now, of course, it's still not the market value of Apple, yes, but it's so successful. We are using it right now. Okay,
there is definitely more leg room here.
Yeah, no, but I mean, so because you think about what would it take to create a new platform. See, the theory of platforms is, especially two-sided platform like Facebook, is that it's very hard to enter because you need to jump immediately to have lots of people using it. It's very hard to start small. Well, unless there is a big shock. Now we have a big shock, so this big shock is a big opportunity to shake up that sector, and I think Slack and Zoom could do it. So I'm very positive on that. And the final one, of course, the big thing is going to be healthcare. So I think the case for some form of universal coverage is much stronger now than it was 2 months ago. And as long as we don't try to turn it into a political, fight over whether it's single payer or not, which is really not the point, I think the idea of some form of universal coverage hopefully is going to gain traction.
Okay, Chad?
I think I was basically on target with that analysis. Concentration will go up. Big firms are going to weather this better than small firms. Of course, lobbying is going to increase. You're handing out $1.1 trillion of government money. People are going to want input into the process that hands that out. And there's not many people making the decision, so it's easy to target the activity. I'm not too worried that antitrust policy is going to change sharply as a result of this, except in the one case that Thomas mentioned, which is healthcare. I think there was pretty broad consensus in the profession, in IO, industrial organization, people in particular, that healthcare had seen a broad-based increase in market power over the last 20 years. You can just see the PR now. Hospitals are going to act like they're untouchable. And I think that that's just something that's going to have to be dealt with. And I can imagine the level of scrutiny in that industry will fall. I don't think other companies are going to be that successful making similar arguments. In terms of, if you have all this small firm death, is the gap going to be filled? One would hope so. Certainly room will open up. I mean, the slight discouraging thing there is we know business formation rates have been falling since the early 1980s. And you'd hope this might turn it around, but at least in the long run trends, we're not seeing this sort of large reserve of people ready to start businesses, and this would be their chance. I think it's going to be slow entry for at least a while going forward.
Okay. Now let's get to some questions that are directly tied to the corona. First one, I'm going to try to get both of you into some hot water. So what grade would you give to the US administration in its response to the corona crisis compared to what we've seen in countries like China, Singapore, South Korea, and of course UK, Germany, Italy, and France? Chad?
Okay, I'm a professor. I guess I give grades for a living. If you talk about the policy before, let's say, March 10th, around there, F. It's an F. Since then, I think we're actually at a B, maybe a C, B to C. There's been a lot more realization that this is an issue that has to be dealt with. I think the mechanics of a lot of specific things, some obvious steps that should have been taken aren't being taken or have been taken slowly. But before March 10th or whatever, nothing was happening. And that was the time where the marginal return to investment was enormous. And to let all that time go by and basically waste it was hugely costly.
And when we look at other countries, what do you think fares better in combating the corona?
Well, everyone brings up South Korea as sort of the platonic ideal of the response. And it's hard to argue with that. That's what we're going to have to do something like that if we're going to be able to all go back to work without a vaccine. We have to have some sort of test and trace program. We have to know how prevalent the disease really is. So we need some random testing as soon as we can get it to know how many people have been exposed and are asymptomatic. And then once we get levels low enough to deal with, we have to be able to isolate and trace those folks who are exposed, or else we're going to be in this stasis for a long time.
Thomas?
Yeah, I think I would give the same grades as Chad. I think what is really the saddest part is when we write the history of this is the time wasted in February, because the first cases in the US were appeared about the same time as in Korea, and the time wasted in February is going to be remembered as that's where a lot of the deaths we're going to see in the next 2 weeks they come from there. So I think that's the saddest part of the response. In terms of the since then, I think it's useful to look at 3 key things. I mean, the short term, right? You have do we have the tests? Do we have the equipment, like the basic, like the mask and the protective gear for the medical personnel? And do we have the respirators, the ventilators? And I think the mask, to be honest, every country was caught by surprise. And then, even like France, all of Europe, it's kind of the same story where you would think it's not that hard to build masks. Yeah, but we were late. I don't think the US is doing great, but I don't think anybody has done that great. The test is, to me, the test and the ventilators are the 2 specific places where the US should have done a lot better for 2 specific reasons. The first is the US was at the frontier of testing in terms of knowledge, in terms of both the physicians, I mean the people in charge, the machines to do testing, and the chemicals that you need to do testing. So the US should have been totally on top of the testing. The fact that the US is so late on the testing stage, I think in there the right comparison is Germany actually. Why is the death rate so low in Germany? Because they've ramped up the testing very efficiently, and the US had the ability to do that. Some other countries did not, right? Because they didn't have the combination of chemicals and machines and people, but the US had and failed to prepare the testing. So I think that's the biggest failure. The second one is the ventilators, and there it's an amazing. I mean, I'm sure we all saw that piece in the New York Times this weekend on the story of the ventilator. So the US actually was aware of this issue, and what's amazing is how it ties up to the antitrust issue. So they back in 2008, the US decided to buy a lot of ventilators to be ready in case of a pandemic. Following SARS, MERS, and so on. And then the cost of the ventilators around $10,000. And there was this new company, a small company, Newport Medical Instrument, I think it was called. And they said they could manufacture it for $3,000. So it was a startup essentially, who had a prototype to be the very small, very light, very cheap ventilator that they could produce at a very large scale. And the government was happy with that. And in fact, these guys won the contract. So how come we don't have them today? Because in 2012, this small firm was acquired by Covidian, the big, healthcare company. And then, for something like $100 million, just above the reporting threshold, 108. So it was reported, but the merger was not investigated. So it went through. And Covidian is a very big firm. So for them, this contract with the US government was tiny and competing with their existing business, which was to build the $10,000 big ventilators. So not surprisingly, they killed the idea. And then we don't have the cheap ventilators because of that. And then finally, Covidian was acquired for $50 billion this time by Medtronic, I think a few years ago. So these small firms, right? You went from this small firm with an idea for $3,000 ventilators that was acquired by Covidian for $100 million, then by Medtronic for $50 billion. And in this gigantic monster, of course, this tiny idea of the $3,000 ventilators completely disappeared from anybody's screen and was dropped. That's why the US today has an issue with ventilators. So that shows you that antitrust does matter.
So we have hundreds of viewers and participants now tuning into this event, and they are interested in concentration and competition. But most of them still ask themselves one question these days: when this nightmare is going to be over? Now we are all bombarded. We are all home, and some of us in lockdown, some of us in quarantine, but everyone is home, and we are bombarded by a lot of information. And I'm curious to know, because as economists, you are trained at looking at numbers and at data, and I'm curious to know, Chad and Thomas, when you now read the newspapers or follow the literature, are there any particular sets of data that you look at when you are trying to gauge when this thing is going to be over?
Who wants to go first?
Go ahead.
Chad?
Okay, so so the first thing you learn is that there's a couple of good models to look at epidemics, and then in fact, tomorrow I'm presenting one of them in seminar at booth. And the thing that's striking is that there is a broad agreement on the structure of the models, how the infection can propagate, but the range of estimates for the key parameters is very wide. So the uncertainty about, the share of people who are asymptomatic, the uncertainty about the true fatality rate is huge, actually. And data from different places give you very different numbers. I mean, one data people like is from the cruise ship, the Diamond Princess, because it's like a closed system, everybody got exposed, and you can start to get some numbers. But then you get data from Korea, you get very different estimate. Then you get data from Italy, you get very different estimate. So I think the truth is that there is a very wide range of estimates of infections and therefore fatalities in the long run. And because of the lack of testing in the US, we know that all the data that is from the past 2 months in the US until very recently is really not reliable because of lack of testing. So it's only now that we start to get a sense of the scale of the issue in the US. And in Asia, the big question, I think, is, when you start reopening the economy, what does it take to prevent the epidemic from starting again? Okay, so that's what we are learning now. And I think the news is mixed. It doesn't seem to be easy, but it seems to be feasible. So I think there is hope there.
Hey, Chad?
So these SIR or SEIR models that Thomas was talking about that the epidemiologists use, it's amazing the breadth of estimates you can get from very modest changes in parameters. These things, I guess anything with exponential growth built into it, you can get huge differences from what are plausible but small changes in parameters. And I think that actually demonstrates the importance of figuring out what these parameters are. And the way to do it is with random testing. And I understand in the world with limited testing, as much as we've been able to ramp it up over the last couple of weeks, we still barely have enough in a lot of metro areas to keep up with the cases. It still would be hugely valuable to set some of that testing capacity aside, excuse me, and test random people and figure out really what is the true prevalence of this thing. How many people have had it and recovered? How many people had it and were completely asymptomatic? We're flying blind. That's a hugely important parameter. You move that thing around a little bit, you get very different estimates of the total effect as this thing works through the population. So I think that has to, in terms of information and the return to information, that's got to be one of the largest things out there. And I'd like to say, I know Germany has started the program with, I think, 100,000 people. The US needs to move to that very quickly.
Yeah,
right.
we'll get the numbers from Germany by the end of April, I think, or something like that, from the random testing. So we'll get a sense. The one thing, though, that seemed to be relatively robust is what the government should do. And, some people might think, okay, is it crazy for the government to tell people to stay home? In the sense that, well, if people are worried about their health, they're going to stay home by themselves. So do you need to add an extra layer and turn something that would have been a recession into something that would be a much bigger recession? And I think there, when we look at these models, the results are pretty consistent. The level of the crisis is very hard to estimate, but what the government should do in response seems to be very consistent. The first thing to understand is that it is true that by themselves, people would take precautions. So imagine there would be no order whatsoever to stay home. You would still have a drop in GDP. you would still have a very big increase in unemployment. Why? Because people would cut consumption. They wouldn't go to the store to the same extent. They would stop flying. They would stop going to the restaurant. So this would have happened with or without the government telling people to stay home. But it would have happened to a lesser extent. Now, if you think about it, the thing that's very clear is that when people make these private decisions, they care about their own health. So they would stop going to the restaurant or stop taking public transportation to minimize the risk of their getting infected. But they don't take into account that how their behavior affect the risk that would infect somebody else. So quite naturally, when the government looks at the same set of problems, it would devise a response which is roughly twice as large as what the private sector would do by himself. So if you think that by yourself, 30% of the people would have decided to stay home, well, it's optimal for the government to say, well, that's going to be 60% now. Because 30% was if I only take into account half of the problem. The government taking the whole thing into account would double it. And on top of it, if you think about the capacity constraint in the healthcare system, then you add another layer. So the response of staying home, even though it looks very brutal and very disruptive, is actually the right thing to do.
Chad, you agree?
Look, a contagious disease, carriers impose a negative externality on everyone else. So we know from economic theory, they're going to take fewer steps than is socially optimal to try to prevent the spread of the disease. I don't know about this number. It's twice as much or half as much. I haven't seen that. So I don't know quantitatively how big that is. I also think that that's a point, for the people who are saying, well, this reduction in activity is so costly, we need to start loosening. They should keep in mind that it's not like we're going to go back to February 15th status quo ante. Everyone's not going to go back out. People are still afraid of getting this thing, and there's going to be a lot of voluntary restriction of labor supply and demand on both sides. So how big that is, I don't know, but I think it would be substantial. So I think those points are basically both correct.
All right. I'd like to move to, we got a lot of questions online. I'm sure we can't answer them all. I'll try to shoot a few questions to you and see. So the first question we have from Gina Franco, and he'd like to know, I guess it's Thomas, it's directed at you. Do you see problems of competition in the car insurance industry in the US?
Car insurance.
Yeah.
I don't know that market at all. So
okay.
I can't speak. I think there I see a lot of price discrimination based on all kinds of demographics, but I do not know if it has become worse or better over time. It ties up a bit to what Chad was saying earlier about the finance sector. The finance sector is very heterogeneous. So I think it's very clear that asset management is competitive in the US and become more so. So I think that's clear. Banking, I think, has been going in reverse to some extent. And insurance, I don't have a strong view.
Chad, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, casual empiricism is that the auto insurance in particular is pretty competitive. I just say 15% on auto insurance, by the way.
Don't say the brand. We are not allowed.
No, I don't, that's the point. You don't even have to.
Right.
But I agree. It's heterogeneous, and it's heterogeneous. I've done work in residential real estate brokerage in the past, and that is a market actually that is considerably less competitive in the U.S. than in Europe. There's an example. There's a chapter for your next book.
Okay, so another question from Francisco. Thomas, based on your research and findings, do you have any specific recommendations or proposal to increase competition in the U.S.? Is only a role of the U.S. government, or companies in the private sector have a role also?
Oh, yeah. So I do, of course. But I can't go into the details. So let me give you the big picture. So the thing that I find striking is that successful antitrust, to me, sounds that it should not be a partisan issue. And in fact, some of the more important deregulations of the 80s were done partly under Carter and partly under Reagan, if you think about airlines and telecoms. And to some extent, I think that should be the goal. Should we go back to some bipartisan approach for antitrust? And the main reason is because it's not so much that I like bipartisan by itself, it's that it's the way of limiting the power of the lobbies. If the two main parties agree on some basic principles on how antitrust should be done, then it gives much less leeway for lobbyists to play one against the other. So that would be like, in terms of the politics, that would be step number one. Step number two, if you think lobbying is an issue, and I do, then I think that I would tend to think that it's better to go after it in terms of campaign finance contributions. So there's a big debate in antitrust about whether we should, use antitrust tool to go after companies that are big just because they are too powerful in the political sense. I'm not super comfortable with that argument. I understand where it's coming from. I would think that if the problem is political power, then the natural way to go after is to limit campaign finance contribution rather than asking antitrust to do stuff that it was not designed for. So this would be the two. And then the third one in terms of licensing regulations is, again, very bipartisan. I think that the government is also partly to blame. I think if you look at the data, the US had, it's a bit like what Chad was saying earlier, the convergence. Europe started with a lot of regulations. And over time, we've decreased it because we realized that many of them were not that good, not very efficient. The US started with very low number of regulations, but has been creeping up over time. And many of them, honestly, they are just not that great.
All right. So another question to both of you actually is what about the workers' earning? How does the data on productivity or market concentration square with the data that workers' income has been stagnated over the past decade? Or put in other words, do we need a labor antitrust movement?
So
go ahead, Chad.
Thomas does have a chapter in this book about that, and he can obviously speak more to what he wrote about. There has been a fair amount of attention paid in the research literature over the last 2 or 3 years to monopsony in the labor market. I think if I had to summarize it, I think everyone thinks that the possibility that it's large is there in a way that people weren't thinking about a few years ago. Whether we know it's large for sure and how big it is, I think is still an open question. Actually, Larry Summers and Anna Stansbury just had a paper come out 10 days ago that basically asserted all these patterns that we've been talking about today, the decrease in investment, the increase in profits, decrease in labor shares, basically coming not from, again, the Econ 101 model of market power, but rather a shift in bargaining power away from labor inputs. I haven't had time to evaluate that closely, but it's definitely part of the conversation, I would say, in terms of trying to explain what's going on.
All right, so we'll end with a Corona question for both of you from Julian. And he asked, what do you guys think are the most interesting questions that are not being widely asked today regarding the current crisis?
I think we are asking a lot of important questions. I think it's that question was more like, again, what Chad was saying earlier. It was 2 months ago. That's when some of the questions should have been asked. I think today, nobody is denying that this is a big crisis, that a lot of things need to happen very quickly. So I think we're asking all the questions now. It's a pity we didn't ask some of them 2 months ago. The one that's going to matter a lot over the next 2 months is going to be what are the steps to restart the economy? Is there a logical order? Which industry first? And all of these things. I think these are the questions that we should have. We should think about over the next months.
I agree.
All right. So the last question would be, it's very difficult to give those kinds of predictions, but still, it's a burning question. So how deep do you think this recession would run?
I think there is no uncertainty about the fact that it's going to be the biggest increase in unemployment and drop in GDP ever in terms of its speed. I think that the only question is whether it's 20% or 30%, but the much of the uncertainty, I think, is on whether it's V-shaped or not. So if you look at forecast, like 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago or something like that, I wrote a tweet saying, I think we're going to have like something like 20% annualized decline. And at that time, people would say, well, that's too high. And since then, everybody, like Goldman Sachs came out at 24. And so all the private sector guys are around 24, 30% drop. But then what they disagree a lot is what happens in the fall. You know, that's what, if you think the range of disagreement about where we're going to be at the end of the year, so on a cumulative like year-to-year growth, is not so much what's going on right now. It's how do we rebound after? And there you have two schools. The one people who think the economy can rebound very quickly, and people who think that the recession is going to be protracted. And I think I don't have any strong belief. I think to me, it's going to depend mostly on whether we have good testing.
Yeah. So one of our participants just remarked, he didn't even ask a question, he just remarked that there is a worldwide depression coming soon. Do you agree it can turn into a depression? Any chances of that, or maybe slim chances?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the question is how fast we come out of it. I think the key question to answering that is how much intangible capital is destroyed by the slowdown, because that stuff is going to have to be rebuilt. We're not tearing down factories and restaurants and things like that. Physical capital is going to be there. It's the organizational effectiveness, the trust between people, co-workers, between the customers and the firms. That's the kind of thing. And then just the financial system too, how much of the trust that operates on trust. If that stuff breaks down because we're gone too long or it's too deep, then it's going to be a slow recovery.
Right. Thomas Philippon, the great reversal. Thank you very much. Chad Syverson, Chicago Bulls. Thank you very much for this great conversation. And thank you, of course, for the audience participating in our first remote online event. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.